Specializing in the field of dystopian surrealism, Polish-born artist Zdzisław Beksiński has drawn comparisons with fellow artist and contemporary H.R. Giger for his darkly fantastical and incredibly detailed compositions, often epic and architecturally complex landscapes. Untitled Painting, however, conveys an intimate scene of two skeletons entwined in a melancholy embrace reminiscent of Rodin's The Kiss. In his own words, "I wish to paint in such a manner as if I were photographing dreams." Look closer at the painting itself and the two figures aren't quite skeletons in the clinical sense. Some accounts describe them as retaining traces of muscle and sinew, which makes the embrace read as more anguished than purely funereal. One figure is taller and appears to cradle the other's skull, giving the pose a protective, almost parental quality rather than a purely romantic one, which is part of why interpretations of the work split between reading it as two lovers or as a parent and child. Their limbs are wrapped so tightly around one another that the two bodies nearly fuse into a single mass, with hands appearing to dig into the other's remaining flesh. An ambiguous gesture that could be read as tenderness or as a final, desperate grip. The surface itself has a carved, almost sculptural quality, with a fine, cracked and weathered texture across the bone and remaining tissue that makes the figures look less painted than excavated, like artifacts unearthed rather than imagined. Around them, a swirling sand or ash-like substance seems to move through the scene, and in the background a haze of smoke blots out most of the light, suggesting the aftermath of some unspecified catastrophe rather than a specific, legible event. The palette is warm rather than cold, built from ochres, rusts and bone tones typical of Beksiński's fantastic period, which gives even this ruined scene an oddly organic, almost living warmth instead of a sterile or clinical one. Guillermo del Toro has described Beksiński's work as treating art as a warning about the fragility of the flesh, and this painting is often singled out as the clearest example of that idea. An image of decay that still insists stubbornly on tenderness. Beksiński worked almost entirely from imagination, rarely giving his paintings titles because he wanted viewers to bring their own interpretations rather than follow a prescribed narrative. He had trained as an architect before turning to photography and then painting full-time in the 1960s, and that architectural eye shows in the crumbling cathedral-like ruins that populate so much of his work. His paintings from this period are often grouped loosely under the label Gothic Surrealism, blending organic decay with structures that feel simultaneously sacred and diseased. Beksiński described his creative process as almost trance-like, insisting he painted intuitively without pre-planned symbolism, which makes the recurring skeletal and fetal imagery feel less like deliberate allegory and more like something dredged up from the subconscious. He lived through the German occupation of Poland and the following decades of communist rule, and while he rejected direct political readings of his work, critics have long noted how the bombed-out, desolate settings echo the trauma of a country rebuilt on ruins. Tragically, Beksiński's own life ended in violence. He was murdered in 2005 by the teenage son of his caretaker. A grim irony given how much of his art meditated on death and decay. Despite the bleakness of his subject matter, he was known to friends as warm, funny and devoted to classical music, which he played loudly while painting. His son Tomasz, a well-known radio host and translator, took his own life the year before his father's murder, adding another layer of tragedy to the family's story. Today, Beksiński's work is housed primarily at the Historical Museum in Sanok, Poland, and has found a substantial cult following online, particularly among fans of horror and dark ambient music, who use his imagery as album art.